With the End and Death Part 3 due out sometime next year, it looks like, after almost 20 years, the Horus Heresy novel series is finally coming to an end. And it's been quite a wild ride. We've had some good books, we've had some great books, and we've also had some, well, let's be blunt, we've had some books that were pretty crap as well, but what do you expect from a series that's over 50 books long? But I digress. The main purpose of this video is to discuss what comes next, because considering that the Horus Heresy novel series has been going on since like 2006, one has to wonder where Games Workshop goes from here, as in like, what would be the next big novel series that they would do? Because as we all know, Warhammer 40,000 is full of events and conflicts that are just ripe for storytelling and, in many cases, have not really been properly explored in prose before. You know, save beyond like, I know, maybe a paragraph or a chapter at the very most in some cases. So I'm going to spitball some ideas of what could be the next big novel series Games Workshop could do. And as a caveat, I'm not saying that any of these should be as long as the Horus Heresy novel series, because 54 books is a lot. In fact, it's even more if you take into account the fact that there's also the Siege of Terror books, which are part of the Horus Heresy series, technically speaking, so that's like an extra 10 novels plus 3 novellas, so that's another 13 books. There's also the Characters series, which is 4 books so far. There's the Primarch series, which is 17 books so far. There's a lot. No, what I have in mind is something more akin to the length of, say, the Beast Arises series or the Dawn of Fire series. You know, something numbering between 8 to 12 books at the very most. So the first idea is, quite frankly, the most obvious and also the most logical one, and that is for Games Workshop to do a novel series based on the events of the Great Scouring. And yeah, it would be a logical place to go, considering that it takes place right in the immediate aftermath of the Horus Heresy itself. You can even potentially make it a Horus Heresy subline if you want, like call it Horus Heresy The Scouring or something to that effect, but it would be good to get some of the events explored in prose. You know, things such as like, you know, the Battle of the Iron Cage, where the Iron Warriors absolutely bodied the Imperial Fists, Perturabo and Lorgar's respective ascensions to demonhood, the traitor legions being driven into the Eye of Terror, and the onset of the Second Founding, which saw the legions being divided into smaller chapters. In fact, the division of the legions into chapters could very well serve as a very good end cap to the Horus Heresy series as a whole, because it's no longer the legions, it's the chapters now, which is a much more 40k, you know, adjacent thing. It's something we recognize more as being 40k than we do 30k, if that makes sense. So yeah, I think that would be quite possibly the most logical way to go, but it may be too obvious, so it may be a little boring, you know, and I can understand that argument. You know, I personally would prefer something else, but I wouldn't be, you know, I wouldn't have any objections to Games Workshop jumping into the Scouring. But this leads me on to my second idea for a possible sequel series to the Horus Heresy, and it's one that, personally, I would very much like. And that's a series based on the events of the Reign of Blood, you know, one of the major events of the Age of Apostasy, because not only did it have the events of Gog Vandire essentially taking control of the entire Imperium, but it also led into the origins of the Sisters of Battle, the Ecclesiarchal Reformation under Sebastian Thor, and more excitingly, effectively what was the Second Siege of Terror, in where the Adeptus Astartes besieged the Ecclesiarchal Palace and had a massive punch-up with the Sisters of Battle, which in turn eventually led to Alicia, Dominica, Catherine, and all the other founding members of the Adeptus Sororitas basically being brought before the Emperor himself, which led to the death of Gog Vandire and the ever-famous line of, "I don't have time to die, I'm too busy." And again, I would very much like this because I think the only time this event has ever been touched upon in fiction, as in outside of codices or sourcebooks, was like one chapter in a Soul Drinker novella titled Deniathos. And that made sense because the Soul Drinkers were one of the chapters that took part in the siege of the Ecclesiarchal Palace. So yeah, I mean, there's a lot to explore here. Maybe a bit more than a trilogy, but definitely, you could definitely get a lot out of this one premise alone. I feel, at the very least. And seeing the origins of the Scissors of Battle written down in depth in a novel, I think that would be really cool. Now, the next idea I had is quite possibly the most controversial, I feel, because I feel quite a few people would be against this, but it has been touched up upon in at least 2 other novels, and from what I've seen, it's been really, really interesting and really cool. And that would be the fall of the Eldari. Like, not the battles between the gods themselves. I don't think you should depict the battles between the gods themselves. I think that should remain, like, mythic, for lack of a better term. No, I'm talking about eyes on the ground from the perspective of the Eldari themselves, the days leading up to, during, and immediately after the fall. And the reason why I think this could work is because within the 2 Phoenix Lord novels we have, the Asurman novel and the Jane Zar novel, those novels alternate chapters between present day and just before and just after the events of the fall. And in the Asurman novel in particular, those last days of the Eldari Empire were really, really fascinating. And seeing the fall happen where, like, the civilian population effectively went into mass rioting and stuff like that, it was really, really engaging. It's really in-depth, really, like, tense. It's like, wow, okay, so I'm getting an idea of how much to shit it actually went, because we all know the fall of the Eldari Empire was, like, a huge shitstorm. But seeing it from the perspective of the Eldari themselves, rather than an omnipresent narrator in a source book, it just hits different, And also, fun fact, in the Asurman book, the Guardians, which we all know as the civilian militia of the Craftworlds, back prior to the events of the fall, the Guardians were actually an Eldari police force, which I thought was kind of cool. It's like, oh, yeah, makes sense, Guardians, yeah, I can see that. But again, I know that idea would be very, very controversial to some people, like, and I get it, some parts of the lore shouldn't really be explored, to keep it more mysterious, keep it more mythic, and I totally understand that. And honestly, it's one of the reasons why I hope they never do any stories set in the War in Heaven. The war between the Old Ones and the Necrontyr, I hope they never touch on that beyond maybe the odd reference here or there, but nothing truly in depth. Because that's one thing I think should not be, fully explained. And to a lesser degree, same with the Terran Unification Wars. Like, we have bits and pieces here and there, like, the aftermath of Mount Ararat in the Constantine Valdor novel, or some bits told here and there in some Horus Heresy short stories, and that's fair enough, but truth be told, I don't think there would be enough material for an entire Unification War series, but that's just my personal opinion. Now, one other idea you could do, which does tie back to the Horus Heresy, and I know some people will be like, oh, I'm going fucking sick of the Horus Heresy, and yeah, I get it. It's been going a long time, but at the same time, you could also potentially tie it into a Great Scouring series, like I mentioned earlier, and that is the last days of the Primarchs. Basically, the surviving Primarchs from the Horus Heresy, Corvus Corax, Rabute Gilliman, etc., their last days before they either were put into stasis, or they disappeared into the Eye of Terror, or were killed, or what have you. Each one could be a potentially interesting standalone novel as part of an umbrella series, but at the same time, I don't know how everyone would feel about that. I think there might be a little Horus Heresy and Primarch fatigue. I mean, I don't know about you guys, but I'm starting to feel it as well, especially with, let's be blunt, how bloated and padded the End and the Death books are. That's just my opinion. Again, I probably said that a lot, but that's one of the perils of doing unscripted videos, but hey. And to finish off for one last idea, is something that we technically have the first book to already, and that's a potential Gathering Storm novel series based upon the Gathering Storm campaign books, which, for those of you who may not be aware, were Fall of Cadia, Fracture of Beotan, Rise of the Primarch. Now, we already have a Fall of Cadia novel, so it would make a degree of sense to follow up on that with a Fracture of Beotan novel and a Rise of the Primarch novel. In fact, Gilliman's Return alone you could probably make into a standalone trilogy if nothing else. Because, considering that we have a book detailing Lionel Johnson's return, but we actually don't have a novel depicting Gilliman's yet. I mean, yes, we have the campaign books, and yes, we have Dark Imperium, which details him interacting with the Imperium after the fact, and after he had returned to Terra and after he had launched the Indomitus Crusade and all that, blah blah blah. But we've never actually gotten a standalone story depicting Guilliman's return, which to me is kinda weird. I mean, again, I know they did it in the campaign book, but it's something you can't actually get anymore, to my knowledge, outside of like maybe Warhammer Plus, for the Vault thing. But yeah, as digital only, I'd rather have something physical to hand, like an actual proper story, like mainly just to see what Guilliman was feeling, like what he was thinking and stuff like that. And while we're on the subject, I would love to see Guilliman's reaction immediately following the devastation of Baal. Kind of like, what he did next after appointing Dante as Warden of Imperium Nihilus, particularly, and this isn't enough for a full novel, just a short story, but I want a story in where Guilliman visits the grave of Sanguinius, visits his brother's tomb. Because as we know from the James Swallow Blood Angels novels, Sanguinius was buried within a great temple upon Baal, and I like to think while Guilliman was on his brother's homeworld, he would have at the very least gone to pay his respects. Because that's the kind of person I think Guilliman would be. He would take the time while he was there to go, like, I miss you, brother, blah, blah, blah. Something at least. And I think that in itself was a huge missed opportunity regarding the end of Devastation of Baal. But I'm ranting again. But what do you think should be Games Workshop's next big novel series once the Horus Heresy finally ends? Leave your suggestions in the comments below. And until next time, this has been Remleiz from 40k Theories, and we'll see you again soon. Bye bye!